Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bartelle's Money Talk. I'm Johnny.
And I am Teresa, and we have a world renowned certified financial planner that is an amazing writer. We came across one of her articles that stopped me and made me look at myself. And this article talks about how where we live is actually rewiring our brains. So now, Hannah, if you could please introduce yourself.
Yes, and that is the most flattering introduction I have ever gotten. Yeah, I'm Hannah. I'm a certified financial planner. I run a newsletter called Your Brain on Money that explores the psychology behind why we make the financial decisions do. I write a lot about money psychology in the context of cultural and social issues. And the particular article that we're talking about today is about how your physical environment, so your neighborhood, your home, can have an influence on your money decisions and vice versa. And I do a lot of content on social media as well. Just a quick background, I was a financial journalist for years, and then decided to get my CFP just to kind of understand the financial world a little bit better. And, just over time, slowly got into the financial psychology side of things because I felt like it was a really big missing piece in the world of financial education and just, solving the financial literacy issue. So that's kind of how I fell into money psychology, and that's how I kind of started this newsletter.
Well, your newsletter is amazing.
Amazing. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, your articles are powerful. Like, your articles are so good. They need to be more than just in a newsletter. It needs to be everywhere so we all can get exposed to the psychology of money, because you talk about it in a practical way. And so that's what we're going to bring to the listeners today. Okay.
I'm excited for it.
Me too.
Right.
You want me to go ahead and
We can kick off.
Yeah, so how I would like for us to start. In your article, you talked about the changes that were made in you because of your environments. And one of the things is you started spending money on things that brought you value. So can you tell the audience a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., and then I moved to New York about 7, 8 years ago. And so I've always lived in semi-urban environments. But New York is obviously a completely different beast. It's extremely urban. Things that most people would use, like, driving a car is not really a factor here. The cost of living is very expensive. Housing is very expensive. And, your physical environment, your community where you live, influences how you spend your money, right? You have to pay your rent, buy groceries, buy other things, and that's very determinative of the area that you live in. And so just over time of living in New York, I really started to think about, and as I got deeper into my journey with money psychology, I started to think about, how is the physical space around me influencing how I'm spending my money? And it was influencing me in positive ways. Like, I was spending money that aligned with my values, which is, close relationships with loved ones, enjoying new experiences, enjoying culture, but also in negative ways as well. I think when you're around lots of people, there's a pressure to kind of spend more money than you need to. And I get into this in the article about social signaling and everything that comes with that. But, just taking a little bit of time to kind of think about how my apartment, how my neighborhood, how the city has just influenced my money decisions, and how in turn my money decisions kind of reinforce my decision to stay in my community. And, I also, so much of this comes in, and I wrote about this later in the article, how I've really embraced urbanism in my time living in New York. And I have kind of supported that value of mine through the way I'm spending money, not just, remaining in New York, but also kind of the causes I'm donating to, my desire to take public transportation more, like supporting the MTA, just little things like that are just perfect representations of how the way that you handle your money actually is a reflection of your values and what is important to you, and how you spend money in your physical environment is a manifestation of that.
Yes, yeah, that's really good. Because who would have thought that because you moved to an urban area that your view on your money would change. It changed your whole psychology of how you spent your money. I mean, who would have thought of that? I mean, I never would have. So
Yeah.
that's it's kind of different. So if you, for example, if you would move to I don't know, if you move from a country setting where you lived in the country and you decide to move to a suburb, and you notice that, hey, I'm in the suburbs, how do you think that would impact someone, their mindset? How do you think that would impact them?
Yeah, I don't want to give the classic answer, it depends, but it depends so much on how that person values money and if they even have awareness. I mean, so much of our money behaviors operates completely unconsciously. We're not even aware that we're, making the financial decisions we do. A lot of them are just based on impulse or based on these kind of unconscious beliefs and emotions we have around money. So, someone someone moving from a more rural setting to a suburban setting, maybe they're moving there because there's more of a schooling system there for their kids. Well, that's a value. Education, wanting a stronger education for your kids is a value, and they're willing to potentially spend more to live in a suburban setting to achieve or to kind of reach that value or that goal. And I think a lot of people don't always put those two and two together. And I think something interesting too is there's always going to be a financial trade-off, right? Living in an urban setting, especially in New York, you just are naturally going to spend more money on housing, for example. But maybe you're closer to your friends, you're closer to your loved ones, you're able to save time because you're not commuting really far every day. So they're all trade-offs that I think people make when they're deciding where to live, but I don't think people always think through how that will influence their financial behavior and how that will influence the way that they view money, in the day-to-day.
Okay, yeah, so let's expound on that because the title of your article, How Your Neighborhood is Secretly Rewiring Your Financial Brain.
Yeah.
So we all as a community, as people, we need to open our eyes to see how our neighborhood or our community is affecting our financial mindset. So can you talk a little bit on how it's secretly doing this, like where we live?
Yeah, definitely. And something I really explore in the article is about how our physical environment specifically shapes our consumption habits. So, for example, living in an urban center, you are just exposed to a lot more people on the street walking around. And financial behaviors, like other types of behaviors, can spread through a social network or community. I think I describe it kind of like a virus. Like, when you're, seeing people wearing a certain type of clothing, if you see enough people doing that, your brain might start thinking, oh, maybe I should buy that. And it's similar to other types of financial behavior, spending and saving. If you're in a community where people are saving a lot of money, people are really financially responsible, you are more likely to be financially responsible too. The whole phrase, I think it's like you're the sum of your the five closest people to you. It's very similar to that in that regard. And I think, our financial behavior intersects very closely with the culture that we're operating in. So if you are living in a community that has a very strong culture, and typically that will come with very specific money habits, your financial behavior will slowly kind of shift to be similar to that kind of cultural norm wherever you're living. And it's just so interesting, and how I think, like I said before, so much of it is unconscious. Like, we're not always thinking about, how much of an influence the people we're seeing on the street every day is having on our financial lives, but it can be, under the surface. I think an example I gave is, I found myself, I was never one that was super into fashion or having my hair done, but, a couple years of living in the city, I think I really started to become a little higher maintenance because I was seeing a lot more people around me that were, dressing in super fancy clothes. And, that again is a form of social signaling, in the same way that maybe in the suburbs, you're seeing, the size of someone's house or the type of someone's car. Like, that's a form of social signaling that people might gravitate towards. It's just all kind of different examples of sort of the same phenomena.
So do you think by seeing some of these signals, do you think that say for instance, if you coming from an environment that you didn't necessarily have those, that you would kind of notice it, and then you move to an environment, now you have these different various social signals. Do you think that forced the actual person that's seeing it that didn't come from that environment previously to like saying, what, if I don't do this, I'll feel out of place? Or how do you think that works?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think evolutionarily, we want to fit in. We want to be part of an in-group. So when you're in a community, when you move to a new community, you have a natural tendency to assimilate. Not saying that every time that's going to happen, many people make conscious efforts to not make that happen, and that's great. That's what brings diversity to a lot of communities. But I think just we have a natural tendency to want to kind of be part of that in-group. And so when you see everybody around you in a community behaving in a certain way, or spending their money in a certain way, you unconsciously might be kind of telling yourself, oh, this is what I should be doing with my money to kind of fit in. And I think that's why, and again, like I was saying before, depending on the type of environment you're in, it can take many different forms. It could be a car, it could be a type of clothing. Clothing is a good example for me because, again, like I live in a city, it's always fun to see, you'll see a very specific hat and you'll see a couple people with it, and then a couple weeks later, you'll see a lot more people with it, and you kind of see see that sort of social contagion kind of spread out over the community over, months. And it's just really interesting to see that play out. And again, like I said, I think a lot of people operate, thinking like, oh, I'm making this very intentional decision to buy this hat. But in reality, it could be these unconscious money patterns, money behaviors just operating under the surface and kind of influencing you in a certain direction, especially when it comes to consumption.
Okay. And so one of the missions that we have for our podcast is that we want to help people learn how different ways on how to grow their money, but we also want to help people have wisdom on living below their means. And one thing that you said in the article was like, basically, we may go looking for a house, but looking for this house has a lot to do with our identity. And so can you talk a little bit to people who they are buying more house than they can afford, not really realizing this financial geography?
Yes. Our money is deeply, deeply emotional. It is often bound up in our sense of identity, how we want others to perceive us, how we kind of want to be perceived by the world. It's so wrapped up in so much. And a lot of people don't realize that. And there also is a kind of interesting disconnect that happens with a lot of people between what they say they want to do with their money and what their actions are with their money. And a lot of that comes from just not unpacking what the values and emotions and thoughts you have around money. So when it comes to something like buying a home, I mean, it's a huge financial decision. So it becomes very consequential for people. So it really dredges up those big emotions that people have about money. And therefore people kind of maybe will view a big purchase like this as, a representation of their self or, their financial success or kind of how far they've come. Homes especially have been kind of traditionally wrapped up in this idea of the American dream, of like making it financially and being financially successful. So I think for a lot of people, it's a very, very, emotional, often clouded decision. It's very hard. I mean, it's almost impossible to make any sort of financial decision perfectly rationally, but I think buying a home is one of the hardest ones because, it's just wrapped up in so much emotion and it's a big long-term purchase. So it's hard not to kind of assign it to this future version of yourself that you kind of want to be.
Future version of yourself.
Yeah, I know. And so, like Hannah, a lot of people, because of your article, what we don't realize is like when we buy more home than we can afford, or we buy just enough home that we can afford, and then you start seeing the Lexuses and you start seeing the Mercedes and the Range Rovers. Would this be considered what you call the invisible hand of your neighborhood? Can you talk on that?
Yes. Wealth is completely relative. How you define if somebody is wealthy or financially successful is completely relative and a lot of times very confined to your community. So if I was a millionaire and I was only hanging out with people that were worth $10 million, I wouldn't feel very wealthy. I would feel pretty inadequate in comparison to them. So what your community is doing and again, like, what they're signaling. So I think, you guys know pretty well that someone could own a bunch of cars and a house and have a negative net worth. And, so what someone's showing on the outside and especially with social media, it's been never easier to kind of show off online with how much money you have, even though, you have no idea kind of what their real financial situation is. And I think that has led to a lot of people in this classic, keeping up with the Joneses, trying to kind of keep up with these spending patterns that is not sustainable for really anybody. But I think everybody feels this sort of pressure to kind of compete or keep up with everybody else. And like I said before, it's all relative. And so much of the, content that I try to do is help people understand like what is enough? What is that like number or that milestone that is enough for you and aligns with your values? Not just this arbitrary, oh, I want to buy a home because everyone's buying a home or, that's what my parents told me to do growing up, to buy a home. Really unpacking like, what are you looking to get out of with your money? Because money really is a tool. It's a means to an end of kind of what your values are and what you want to kind of get out of this life. And I think once you unpack that, you're able to kind of remove yourself from this sort of like rat race of trying to keep up with everybody else, because as you guys probably well know, you're never gonna win that race. It's just gonna be kind of this ongoing fight forever.
Hamster wheel.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that was a good question, but let me ask you this question because I noticed in your article too, you spoke in reference to financial geography. And I really could you kind of talk about that and kind of expound on that a little bit?
Yeah. So this is similar to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation where, different types of environments, urban, suburban, rural, etc., can create completely different default default financial behaviors. So, the classic example that I think I gave in the article is, okay, when you're living in an urban setting like New York, your car expenses are going to go down or completely go away because you might not have a car. When you're in a more rural setting, that might be one of your big expenditures. Same going with like housing costs. And I think I kind of broke this down kind of throughout the article, comparing, what the average suburban dweller will pay and what their budget will look like versus what a urban dweller will look like. And again, it's not, that doesn't always necessarily mean that, the urban dweller is spending a lot more money. They're just spending it in different ways. And again, it goes back to this idea of, thinking about where your money's going, but thinking about, is this actually where I want my money to be going? If I was living, as someone who really values having access to public transportation, living in a walkable city, that's something that I really value. If I lived in a very car dependent neighborhood and I was spending, like hundreds of dollars on car insurance, I think I would feel a lot more, anxiety or stress about my finances because they weren't going to something that felt really important to me. And that's where I think, financial geography comes in. And that's why I think it's important to think about, like, how does my kind of environment where I'm living affect the money decisions I'm making every day? I mean, a small example that I just thought of is, I find myself all the time on my way home from work stopping at my bodega at the end of the corner and getting like a piece of candy or like a sweet treat, which I probably would never be able to do if I lived in a suburban neighborhood. I end up spending, that kind of adds up every other day. But, that's just something that happens when you're living in a different environment. Again, like how those little impulsive purchases that I'm making, wouldn't happen for somebody in a different environment, but maybe they're making impulsive decisions in a different way.
Okay, because now I'm going to load you up with this one, okay?
I'm ready.
You mentioned that people need to unpack basically and figure out when enough is enough. And so when people listen to this conversation, I want them to stop and evaluate their lives and say, how much is my area, how much is where I live, my job affecting my financial brain? And for some people, in order for them to be able to retire, they may have to change their geographical location in order for them to get to where they need to be. So with you being a certified financial planner, can you speak to the person that needs to listen to this video, stop and say, is my environment keeping me from obtaining what I really want out of life?
Yeah, I would say, everything is a trade-off, and you have to just make these decisions. Sometimes they're very hard decisions, but you have to make them based on what is most important to you and what your values are. And you're not going to be able to make those decisions if you don't know what they are, or you don't know kind of what the priority is. So for example, somebody who is weighing, maybe needing to change their environment or change locations, downsize homes, for example, to be able to afford their retirement. Well, if you have an emotional attachment to your house, if you're thinking, it is very, very important to me to have this house for my grandkids to visit, I really like this community. Okay, maybe that is the most important thing to you. Well, maybe that means you might need to work longer and retire later to be able to support that. Or you might need to look at additional streams of income, save more, cut back now to save more, what have you. Again, it's kind of all about those trade-offs, and you just have to make those. I mean, at any age, you really have to make those to kind of achieve your financial goals. But again, you're going to always be happiest when you know your values, the hierarchy of your values, and it just makes financial decisions so much easier, because we all have to make difficult financial decisions all the time, but you will definitely sleep kind of better at night knowing that you made a decision that was in line with truly what was most important to you.
And for some people, that might be,
that's hard.
It might be hard to do, but like you said, if you can unpack it, and then you said in your article is that like once you moved and got settled in your ways, you started spending money on things that brought you joy.
Yeah. And that was really important for me too. I was somebody who traditionally had a lot of money anxiety. The beginning of my career, I was very focused on saving as much money as possible, making as much money as possible, like getting a bunch of side hustles, working extra. And I kept kind of having these like arbitrary benchmarks of like, okay, when I hit this amount of savings, I'll feel better. When I hit like this net worth, I'll feel better. And, as I started, getting more into financial psychology and learning more about that, it made me realize like, oh, these are kind of these unconscious beliefs that I have about money, this anxiety that I have, what am I actually saving for? This is causing me more anxiety than it's causing me, security and safety that should be coming with saving money. What's happening here? And it actually led me to kind of release a little bit of that kind of tight grip that I had and allow myself to spend money, especially on things that brought me joy. For example, going out to plays, going and having dinner with my friends. I mean, that money that I would spend on those events brought me so much more joy than it just sitting in my bank account earning interest, So again, it is really all about trade-offs. And I personally don't always advocate for the life of complete deprivation and saving, and then also obviously the life of living beyond your means. There's definitely a middle path there, and kind of in that messy middle, it really comes down to, again, what's important to you.
Wow, what's important to you? So I guess one of my questions is, because that's true, what's important to you? So if you were talking to somebody and say if they shifted like you did to a new environment, and you went from saving and like, okay, I need to save versus now I'm in this new environment and I feel a whole lot different about money and money habits. And you meet somebody like this, what advice would you give them to kind of break, that pattern of saving and not really, I can't say do anything with it, but just letting it sit there.
Being a tightwad.
Yes.
Yeah.
And just letting it sit there
Yes.
versus doing like you did. Like, you know what? Now I'm enjoying my money and I'm spending on something that I enjoy.
Yeah. The most common question that people will DM me about, ask me about is, I have X amount of money in a bank account, $1,000, $10,000, $100,000. What do I do with it? And I always say, well, tell me about yourself. Like, what do you like to do? What goals do you have in life? Not necessarily financial. And, really just talking to someone, even for just 5 minutes, you can pretty quickly kind of start to identify where their true passions are, or where they really do see their life going. And I think a lot of people will have certain goals and not see how money can kind of help support that goal. And, so just spending some time thinking about kind of what do I want to kind of get out of this life, and then the other piece of that is kind of going backwards and thinking, okay, what were my memories around money? What kind of emotions come up when I think about money or handle money? What are some kind of behavior patterns that I have around money? Like for me, it was checking my bank accounts constantly, identifying some of those really recurring patterns can really help start to unwind some of the unhealthy behaviors that you might have around money. And it's really just bringing awareness. And then from there, once you have that awareness, you can break that feedback loop and can start actually making actionable, sustainable change. And then also what I tell everybody is it's a lifelong journey with money, and the most sustainable path, or the best path to follow with money is the one that is true to you and that you can sustain for decades. It shouldn't be a bunch of rules that are impossible for you to follow. It's almost like going on a diet, right? Like you want to do something sustainable that you enjoy eating the food, and it's something that you could do for many years. It's the exact same when it kind of comes to your money.
Okay, because what I want to know, this conversation is going to help somebody. That's what I'm speaking, and that's what I believe. Okay, so you had all of this anxiety around money, but I do believe that you had to have a trigger. Something had to happen to make you say, okay, I have an issue. What was that trigger?
Yeah, so like I said, I had kind of these numbers in mind of like, okay, I'm going to save for, this, or like, and I remember I was kind of like saving up for a specific number, and then I got to the number and I remember thinking, what am I going to do with this? And it actually was during the COVID pandemic, when there was just so much uncertainty. There was like a period of a couple months where, I didn't know if I was going to lose my job. It was just so much uncertainty happening in the world. And I remember thinking, okay, well, what do I actually want to do? I think for so long I just had my head down in the sand, just working and accumulating. And it was like, okay, where do I want to go from here? And I think that was kind of the moment where I thought, what do I actually value? And again, I think a lot of the anxious behaviors around money, like again, checking my bank accounts lots of times, just was generally my way of trying to feel in control of my financial situation. And, I think when, like I said, back in COVID, when there was all that volatility in the market, I remember feeling those anxious feelings, and I was like, oh, this is like a coping mechanism to try to make me feel more in control of a situation that I have no control over. And I think that was kind of the catalyst for me to say, okay, this isn't actually serving me, these behaviors. Let's take a step back. Let's focus on the fundamentals, the fundamentals that most people know. You don't even need to be a CFP to kind of know the fundamentals, which is, don't try to time the market. If there's volatility, typically just let it kind of ride out. And kind of once I was able to get through that period of, untangling myself from anxiety, I was able to actually kind of take a breath and say, okay, what do I want to do with my money? What's important to me? How do I want my money to kind of work for me?
Okay, so what practical advice would you give to someone that has some anxiety around money? Because there's a lot of people, Hannah.
I know. And I think we're definitely reaching a point where people are talking about, financial anxiety more. But I do think that, I think the taboo nature of money just makes financial anxiety more nefarious, because I think people think that, oh, I can't discuss this with people, when really almost everybody deals with financial anxiety. And it's interesting because it can manifest itself in such different behaviors. So you take someone like me who is, checking my accounts all the time, was really anxious to kind of spend money on things, or maybe it's avoidance. Like, I knew people who wouldn't open any of their bills. They wouldn't ever check their accounts because they were just, they didn't want to deal with the problem. But in terms of practical advice, the first thing, and I hope I don't sound like a broken record, is just have some awareness. When you feel this overwhelm of anxiety, when you think about money, just stop and think, okay, why am I feeling this way? Where is this coming from? For me, it was fear of the unknown, or it was the uncertainty. For some people, it could have been a previous experience, financial trauma. Financial PTSD is a real thing. Maybe they went through a traumatic financial experience that's kind of leading to these behaviors now. Maybe it's the way you were raised, the way your parents talked about money. Just having some awareness of where that's coming from, asking yourself why, and try not to have too much judgment. You're just observing. You're just trying to understand why you're feeling and behaving the way you're feeling. And, just a couple things that have worked for me is, getting all the thoughts out there. So, writing things down, recording, like, this is when I felt anxious about my money, talking, writing through that way. And some people really benefit from going to financial therapists, for example. For me, personally, setting boundaries has helped a lot. I actually will put aside time on my calendar. Like, okay, this is my 30 minutes every week to go through my finances and, balance my budget. I am not going to check my accounts until that period on my calendar. And that has worked tremendously for me. Because I think, again, it makes me feel in control. I feel like I have control of my situation because I have something on the calendar, but I'm not spending like multiple times a day going to check my bank accounts and the number has not changed and I'm still checking it. So, and I think it's something that really goes along with financial anxiety too, is like that catastrophizing, like, oh, I could lose all my money, all of that. Instead, why don't we get a little bit more realistic? I think it does help to just plan kind of for potential scenarios, but let's get a little bit more realistic. Like, make a game plan. Think about like, okay, what will happen if XYZ happens? And again, that'll make you feel more in control of your situation.
That was real good. And financial therapist, I should be embarrassed, but I didn't know that was a thing. A financial therapist?
Yeah, it's a growing field. I would say probably in the past couple years, but it is a real thing. And it's so interesting because money is such a huge part of our lives. And it is funny, in therapy, I think a lot of people don't get asked about their finances because it's just not considered part of someone's kind of inner life, when really it's a huge part of our inner life. So this is definitely kind of a growing field in therapy that I'm glad that's kind of getting addressed more. And I think it helps a lot for individuals. And also I know, especially for couples, this is a very common, path to just work out like different money mindsets or money conflicts around couples, because it's a really big part of any relationship.
It is.
You're right. And
yeah.
And who would have thought? Because you're right, money is the center of everything that we do. Whether just living our lives, going out day to day, we have to spend money doing pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Well, Hannah, we don't want to keep you over because you're going to have to be one of our guests that come back. But before we let you go, can you sum up how our geography affects our financial brain for everyone?
Okay, I will try my best. Also, have me back anytime. But if I could sum it up, I would say where we live doesn't just it affects how we spend money, but it also affects how we view money, how we save money, our long-term financial goals and values. Our physical space can often change the way that we consume, the way that our values around money. And I think just thinking about how these external factors can influence our financial lives can help us make sure that our money choices are aligning with what is truly important to us.
Okay, well, thank you. All right.
Nice, I like it.
I've drained her.
All right. Well, Hannah, we want to thank you for
Thank you.
joining us on Bartelle's Money Talk today. I mean, the conversation has been absolutely great, and we look forward to you coming back to join us again on
Please.
Bartelle's Money Talk so we can have another conversation. So thank
Great.
you.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much.
Of course. Thank you so much. And now, Hannah, can you tell everyone where to find you and how to find your magnificent articles?
Yes, you can find me on any social media platform at Your Brain on Money, and my Substack is yourbrainonmoney.substack.com, and I put out weekly essays about money psychology, like I said, in the context of social, economic, cultural issues. So that's where you can find me.
Okay. Now, do you do any consulting, or you basically put out content?
I basically put out content for now. Yeah.
Okay, but if someone reaches out to you, you might can give them some advice, or maybe send them somewhere else.
Definitely, yeah. Either I will give you an answer, or I will direct you to a resource that will have the answer.
Okay. All right. Well, Hannah, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes.
This has been a treat. It has been eye-opening for me. I learned about there's a financial therapist. So thank you again for joining us.
Yes, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome.